US President Donald Trump has declared what he calls an economic D-Day against Iran, promising the most crushing economic operation ever imposed on a country. But there is a fundamental question behind the threat. Can the United States actually isolate Iran? Trump is threatening not just Iranian companies, but foreign banks, businesses, airports, government entities, ship registries, and financial networks that provide Tehran with what he calls a lifeline. The targets include oil smuggling, cash transfers, exchange houses, swap lines, and front companies as well. But Iran is not starting from zero. Years of US sanctions have already forced Tehran to build an alternative trading system, one that relies heavily on China, neighboring countries, intermediaries, and so-called shadow fleets as well. China is by far the most important piece of this puzzle. Before the war, China accounted for about 90% of Iran's crude exports. While crude oil flows have fallen by a third since then, the value of that relationship is much larger than official customs figures suggest. So Trump's problem is simple, but it is complicated. You cannot completely isolate Iran unless you can also shut down the channels connecting Iran to its biggest buyers, and that could mean confronting China. Now, that does not mean Trump's strategy cannot hurt Iran. It already has. The Iranian economy is facing an extremely difficult combination of war, sanctions, disrupted energy exports, and currency pressure. And let's not forget the decades of sanctions which Iran has learned to live with. The IMF currently projects Iran's economy will contract 5.4% this year, and consumer prices are projected to rise by almost 69% this year. Now, Iran's non-oil economy, however, gives Tehran additional channels. Iran's export basket includes natural gas, propane, bitumen, methanol, steel, metals, and petrochemical products. But Iran's trade goes well beyond China. For its non-oil exports, Iran's biggest destinations include China, Iraq, UAE, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Oman. On the import side, the UAE, China, and Turkey are the biggest suppliers, followed by India, Germany, Russia, and the Netherlands. UAE has now suspended trade and financial transactions with Iran, a major blow because Dubai has historically been an important commercial and financial gateway for Iranian trade. But that also shows the limits of a simple US versus Iran narrative. Gulf countries are primarily trying to protect their own economies and security. They are not necessarily signing up to every US objective. And this is where Trump's economic war becomes a domestic political problem as well. The national average price of regular gasoline is over $4 a gallon, and that is more than 25% above a year earlier. California is even more expensive. Diesel is closing on a $7 per gallon mark, roughly 35% higher than a year ago. So Trump's economic war creates a paradox. The harder Washington squeezes Iran and the longer Hormuz remains disrupted, the greater the risk of an energy-driven inflation problem at home. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi dismissed Trump's economic punishment plan, saying that it is a diversion from America's own crisis. He pointed to rising debt, interest costs, and fuel prices. He also added that America's policies threaten global economy and sovereignty worldwide. So can Iran really be isolated from the global stage? To discuss this with me is Mark Brolin, geoeconomic and geopolitical strategist and author. Mark, pleasure having you here with me on the show. Let's start right off. Given the leverage Iran has found over the Strait of Hormuz, how economically isolated can US push Iran to be at this point? Over to you.
Well, I think among all the headlines about US not winning, I think we tend to forget that, as you were saying before, Iran is also not winning. And it can't be totally isolated, as you were also saying, but I think it can add additional pressure. And together with some other black swans or other effects, it can be possibly a game changer. We can't rule it out, at least. UN claims that the food inflation in Iran is now around 130%. So the problem in Iran for the people is not that there is a lack of food, but they don't have they don't have the money to buy it, and that could trigger unrest. And I think that's probably what the U.S. regime is hoping for. They can't cut off totally. As you're saying, this might end up with a clash with China, and I'm not sure either U.S. or China would want that. And we know from before that Trump talks big, and sometimes it doesn't mean so much. So this might be a negotiation gambit again. But we do have some changes. One of them you mentioned before, UAE suspended trade and financial transactions. That's actually a big change because Iran is quite dependent on them. And then we have over the last days something else that might also be changing things, and that's the southern shipping corridor in the Strait that might be opening up. We don't know if it will be secure or not, but if it is, and additional vessels will go through there, that could also add things. But I would say this is not good news for Iran, of course, but and it will add pressure on them. Yes.
Understood. Mark, here let me bring back the Strait of Hormuz, because that is one element that has come into main headlines ever since this war started. Iran has found a strength that it did not know it possessed, and it's found it right in its backyard. The longer US continues to choke out Iran economically, the harder Iran tries to grip the Strait of Hormuz, and that would include firing at unarmed vessels, creating fear, imposing its dominance in this region, which is geographically close to Iran. That eventually hurts the US, given the rising oil prices and gas prices in the US. Now, the problem, and where I counter you here, is that there is a clock ticking for Donald Trump. That's the midterm elections. Iran has been under sanctions for decades. So there's no such sudden deadline that they're looking at, but Trump is. Do you see it differently?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And that's why I'm saying that it might be just a gambit from Trump's side. He wants to have he wants to add so much pressure that there finally will be some sort of deal with Iran ahead of the elections. And Iranian regime knows that. So they're playing down the clock in that sense. But then again, they are under immense pressure themselves. I think they are more afraid of their own people than they are of Trump, because they know they have found a way to sort of tackle the US, even though it's, of course, the strongest military on the planet. And they have found a way to tackle that. But if the people would revolt again, that could be a different thing. And of course, we know that this kind of thing can add national patriotism in a way when you're opposed by a foreign power.
Mark, I'll just come in there. We saw a revolt earlier this year, and we saw the mass killings that took place in the thousands. 3,000 was what Iran acknowledged, over 3,000, and then the global figures ranged anywhere between 20,000 to 40,000. So there has been a revolt not too long ago, and it was really clamped down. Do you really feel that the people will try to rise up, and that's something Donald Trump thought would happen? It never did.
No, I mean, nobody really knows, but there will be some sort of tipping point in the end. If they can't find food, then it might happen. But it's only one scenario. I probably agree with you. It's not the likeliest scenario right now, but we shouldn't rule it out. I think it's likelier than many people think, because I think the Iranian regime is more hardly pressed than is commonly the common assumption and what many people say. But I think this might, and we know that the hardliners in Iran, they have had the upper hand over the last coming weeks because they've seen us winning against Trump. And if this economic sanctions start to bite, it might be a change within Iran. So those wanting to have a deal, because we know there are leaders in Iran as well who do favor a deal, because they are saying that the bargaining power might have peaked already or is peaking right now. So if this starts to bite a bit more, the Iranian hand might weaken. And then there might be a deal after that. And I think that's what sort of the Trump administration is fishing at, is trying to strive for right now. And but if we have to have a likely scenario, the likeliest scenario, I think that might be the likeliest scenario. That might be, in the end, there has to be some sort of deal or face-saving deal for both sides.
One would hope that deal is achieved. But as you enlist and as you list out all the pressure that US has put on Iran, let me quickly also just do a quick count of the strengths Iran realized over the course of the last 6 months. Strait of Hormuz is number one, no doubts. Then Iran fired across the Gulf at US bases across the Gulf, and that meant all its neighborhood, they had to quietly take those missiles, they could take those drones, those projectiles. None of them acknowledged hitting back at Iran, and that they may have defended themselves, but that's all that they could do, relying on the US and Israel eventually to take this further. The other part of it is the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which in the last almost 1 month, you're getting that sense that Iran is now trying, or largely through the Houthis, choking out that waterway as well. One can only imagine, and one dreads to imagine, the impact that would have on the global economy if that route, that critical waterway, also gets choked out. So these are strengths that Iran has realized over the course of these last 6 months, thanks to the war, ironically. So when you put these strengths against the economic choke points, do you feel they get offset, or do you feel eventually Iran is going to choke out? But they haven't done so in the course of these last 6 months or the course of the last 50 years.
No, I agree. And it's a great point. And I think we have all been surprised that they have been able to be as strong as they have been, that they have been able to put off the US and some of its allies, even though the US have not found so many allies that it would have wanted to. But then again, also Iran, I think that the counter argument to that, to all that, is that Iran is not going to withstand all this forever. I mean, they are bleeding dry, much more so than the US in a sense, because of, I mean, it's the pulse, their economic pulse is the strait, and it's cut off. So they are, I mean, they are losing money every day because of this. So they actually can't keep up forever. And I think that's why at some point, even they have to make a deal, despite the strengths they have shown to have.
Let me just quickly bring in one more point there, Mark. China's relations with Iran, we elaborated on that during the report that I read out before we started interacting. But then there was something that took place during the funeral ceremonies of late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Delegations came, and these were largely senior delegations from nearly 70 plus countries, and that included Saudi Arabia, that included Turkey, that included Qatar. Now, these Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and there was also a missile which was heading towards Turkey. Iran never acknowledged, but NATO defenses came into play and protected. All these nations had missiles coming their way over the past number of months, but they still sent their delegations for that funeral ceremony. What does that tell you about how Iran is being seen by its immediate neighborhood, and eventually what kind of strength it has drawn or projected?
Well, I think it's a mixed picture. I think most of the Sunni countries don't like Iran, famously, and they do so even less so today, I think, because relatively speaking, towards Saudi and Turkey, that Iranian regime is actually relatively weaker than it was a few decades ago, because of the already weak economy, even before all the sanctions, and now it's even weaker still. But then again, China will never want to see Iran lose out, because then the Middle East will turn much more under the sphere of influence of the US. So, of course, as you were starting this commentary today, that you were saying that this might boil down to a thing between the US and China, and I think that's the greater danger. And I think without Chinese support, Iran would not be able to make it for more than a couple of weeks. They are so dependent, as you were also saying, on selling their oil to China. So I think this might boil down to will US actually tighten the restrictions as they are promising now, and will they take on the Chinese transport shipping companies, or will they not?
Well, that's a question for the US, and that's a major question. Will they want to even look for an answer for that question? That remains a question in itself. As of now, we understand that this is really in a deadlock, which no one expected, and least of all US or Israel expected it to last this long. We leave it there for now. Mark Rowland, pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Pleasure.